Morning, everybody. You seem particularly subdued this morning. You're not very loud. Subdued.
Oh, yeah.
It's like the weight of the world is crushing your spirits or something. It's the end of the semester, of course. Well, that's why I'm hoping that this will be a little bit lighter. Maybe we'll lighten the mood a little bit and talk about genetically modified organisms. So at this point, 4 out of 5 of you are saying that you'd like to see genetically modified organisms labeled as such in the class. And about 20% saying no, they don't need to be labeled. Okay. So what we're here to do today is to figure out, have a discussion about what constitutes a genetically modified organism, how do we define it, and then to look at a few case studies to try to better inform ourselves about what it means to be genetically modified and maybe to break the stereotype of what we think genetically modified means. So at the outset, I suppose I should say that my view is slightly pro-GMO, but I don't want you to take, I'm trying to present both sides of the argument today. But that's my own personal perspective. So I've got bias, yes, and that's why I'm telling you that I've got bias. Right, so there's no conflict of interest. By the way, I do not own any stock in any of the companies that produce genetically modified organisms. I'm an innocent bystander, but I happen to be a geneticist. Speaking of genetics, please come today if you're interested in seeing another of our population biology faculty candidates who's on campus today doing her interviews, 3 o'clock here. Sounds interesting, sexual selection and sexual conflict. Something we'll talk about, not a particular type of sexual conflict. So we'll start talking about that in this class, Genetic Diversity Mating Systems, on Friday. Okay. Quick in-person poll. Don't use Socrata for this. Here are a bunch of random, no, not really random pictures I chose from Google Images. Which of these qualifies as a GMO? So it's a trick question. Wait, so, okay, it's the tomato. So we've got a tiny tomato, we've got a huge tomato. Which one do you think is GMO? At least it doesn't have eyes or anything. Okay, now it's really genetically modified. Turns out that is not genetically modified in one sense, that scientists didn't insert genes into the huge tomato to make it huge. So the tomato example is a case of, which we'll see in a little while, a case of natural or artificial selection. Right? Existing genetic variation in tomatoes in the wild that humans cultivated to make small tomatoes and big tomatoes. Yeah, please.
Can I ask you a question about the genetic modified?
Please.
You said that sometimes the things that we have from our environment affect the DNA that our children end up inheriting. It doesn't always stay the same from generation to generation.
Yeah.
Is it possible that if we eat from this genetically modified food, that might affect our DNA that we pass on to our kids that they inherit?
So, excellent question. If we eat in transgenic organisms that have been genetically modified, will that affect us, and would it possibly affect future generations? It's a good question to keep in mind. I'm going to try to circle back to that a little bit later, after we've looked at a few examples. But remind me if I don't answer that directly. Are any of these pictures not of genetically modified organisms? We've got apples, we've got rice. So let's see, here, apples, rice, salmon, what's that? Grapevine, because hey, we're at Fresno State and we make good wine. What about the banned genetically modified food t-shirt? What's that? What's the food that's on it though? Corn. So the question is corn genetically modified? How so? In what sense?
Resistant to certain pesticides or
Okay, so we might have genetically engineered corn that's resistant to pesticides, and
We've had corn was bred from grass, and we kept make it what it is today. So in a sense, it is genetically modified.
Okay, so then the point over here is that as we learned a few weeks ago in class, what was Teosinte a couple thousand years ago, humans bred naturally, some might claim, into what we now know as corn or maize. So does that count as genetically modified?
You have to define what genetically modified means if they're inserting genes versus us just artificially.
Yes, please.
I thought genetically modified corn produces pesticide in some tissue.
Ooh. So is it possible that a genetically modified plant produces a pesticide by that same plant?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that, but I would suspect that it's possible.
I live like towards Fowler, so
Yep.
people when they have like farms, they put corn around it because it also pesticide and protects the other.
Interesting. So what I'd like you to do, so corn protects other plants. What I'd like you to do now, as it says up here, now that we've gotten into the question of how exactly do you define what genetically modified means, take 5 minutes, get into your, if you want to use your exam groups, feel free, small groups. I'd like every group to come up with your definition of what genetically modified means, and then post it to todaysmeet.com/rossgenetics. I'll come around and answer any questions you've got, and we'll come back together just after 11:10. So you think the easiest way to produce a transgenic animal is to take genes out of one species, put it into another one? Well, let me ask you this. For the case of Teosinte and maize, how long did that process take? Years and years and years, 1,000 years, 1,500 years, something like that. We're too damn impatient people to do that anymore. Well, maybe. But it's faster, certainly, to just take a trait that you're interested in and put it in a different organism. Do you think it matters, personally, do you think it matters whether or not you move an allele, a version of a gene, from one member of a species into another member of a species? Or do you think is there a distinction to be made between within species genetic engineering and between species? Is it critical that the move be, this DNA is not in this species, but now we've put it in there? Is that essential to the definition of a genetically modified organism?
I think so because I don't think there's going to be some evolution of some species of genes like you just might think like the GFP gene in a rat that makes it glows. I don't think a rat would ever get that gene from a jellyfish to ever do that. That we make it artificially.
Yes, please tell me some way that a rat would somehow acquire the green fluorescent protein gene from a jellyfish. A rat happens to be swimming around in the ocean and eats a jellyfish, and one of its gut cells happens to take up the DNA from this jellyfish it just ate. Yeah, won't happen. Well, at least it's not very likely to happen. Never say never in genetics. Okay. So the thing about moving genes between members of a species is that we can do that artificially by artificial selection by mating organisms together, like Teosinte, selecting for certain characteristics. The reason it takes so long is because, why does it take so long to do that form of natural artificial selection? Why did it take 1,500 years to turn Teosinte into corn? So a number of generations. So what's the generation time of corn? Let's assume it's a year. I don't know. Let's assume it's a year. So it takes a number of generations. Okay. What else? What else controls the clock of how rapidly we can naturally make reproduction rate, which corresponds to generation time. So how many offspring does an individual corn plant have? So how many corn are there in the wild? And that's directly related to something that's very genetics-y. I'm making up words now. What do we have to wait for if we have Teosinte, that little tiny scrawny thing with the hard encased fruit? What do we have to wait for? We have to wait for the mutation that we learned about in class that causes those fruit cases to be softer or to be exposed. That's one of the rate limiting steps. So it's how long the organism takes to reproduce, maybe how many organisms there are in the world, And then the mutation rate. How likely is it that at some point in time that random mutation does what we're trying to get it to do? And that's where genetic engineering, which is part of GMOs, comes into play. So a lot of you have definitions up here that talk about doing something in a laboratory, inserting genes. So that's designing genes even. Now that we know that this one mutation causes Teosinte to have these open fruit cups, we could probably go into the lab and make our own maize by genetically engineering that one mutation. And we would do that a lot faster than it was for our ancestors to wait thousands of years for that mutation to show up in the first place and then naturally and artificially select for it. So it's hard to come up with a consensus. Again, I do invite you to look over those definitions that all the groups came up with and see if you resonate with any of the other points that some of the groups made. But to me, it looked like the consensus was moving genes between species. That's something you can't do by breeding schemes, because by definition, selective breeding is between members of the same species. You can't cross members of different species. So there is no way for a rat to get a jellyfish gene. With rare exception, never say never, rare exception. So the next question is, if you think you know something's genetically modified, how do you know for sure? That's one of the reasons I asked, do you think GMOs should be labeled? And again, about 80% of you said yes. So is this genetically modified? This is not photoshopped, by the way. Some of these are. I'll try to remember to point out which ones are photoshopped and which ones are real. These are real. Is this nature or nurture? Nurture. So what happened to these watermelons if it's not their genes that made them be square? Yeah, so if you've scrolled ahead, or if you knew this already, you can go to I think it's melonmold.com or something like that. You just buy these little acrylic boxes that the fruit grows in. You can do this with pumpkins, you can do it with watermelons, whatever. Apparently Disney World or Disneyland grows Mickey Mouse shaped pumpkins. They have these glass molds and the fruits hang in the air and they expand to fill the mold. So these pumpkins look like Mickey Mouse with the head and the two big ears. So you can make square pumpkins this way. So in this case, this is nurture, right? It's environment. This has nothing to do with being genetically modified, but you might see that picture and think, some crazy scientist has been tinkering in the lab with nature. How do you cut them up? Really easily, because they don't roll around when you're trying to cut them in half. And presumably that's the reason you would make cubic watermelons, is because it avoids the grocery packer's problem, which is that if you have a bunch of spheres, you've got a lot of wasted space when you ship things.
Now you just play Tetris.
So we could do all sorts of cool things with those. Or apparently play Minecraft, right? We got like little Minecraft pumpkins down here. Okay, so this is a big question, is please, the takeaway I want for that slide is just be cognizant of the fact that when you see somebody say, or hear somebody say, this is genetically modified, ask, wait, is that picture you're showing me because of an external treatment of the environment, or is it an actually genetically modified fruit? What about these? So there's a company in Delano, the Grapery. Maybe you've heard of these. Maybe you've tasted some of these. I had some of the cotton candy grapes about a year ago. Taste like cotton candy. They have kind of a burnt caramel undertone when you eat them. So they taste kind of like cotton candy. What do you think? Genetically modified or not? Stick some genes in that make them taste like cotton candy? Or make them really long. These are the witch's fingers grapes, these huge, really long grapes. So, let's see, somewhere there, does it say non-GMO? Yeah, right there, yeah. So, here's the real question. It's a local company. They claim that this is not genetically modified. So, what's the process they use? That's a good question. And then, does it match our definitions? So let's figure out how they made these grapes, and then I'd like you to apply your definitions and decide if this is genetically modified or not. Okay, so here's a screenshot from their frequently asked questions page on their website. The top two relate to this question. So are your grapes genetically modified? How do you make these wonderful flavors? So they've got years of natural crossbreeding, and they cultivate them under ideal growing conditions, which presumably every grape manufacturer does. I don't know how that's different from everybody else. So presumably, according to what their public-facing side of the company, they're using traditional breeding programs. They're selecting for flavors of grapes that taste a little bit like cotton candy. You cross that grape varietal with this one, you get one that tastes a little bit more like cotton candy, and over time you develop a grape that has that sort of flavor. So what do they say about whether or not their grapes are genetically modified? It's artificial selection. So it's humans picking phenotypes. That grape tastes a little bit like cotton candy, as I just explained. Let's cross it with this other plant or a sibling to make a plant that maybe makes more of that chemical, whatever it is, that tastes like cotton candy.
The way you get away with this by saying it could potentially have existed in nature without our own.
So all of these mutations happen in nature, in the field anyway. These aren't in the laboratory scientists tinkering with DNA. This is just natural mutations in different grape vines that produce grapes that have these distinct flavors. So they say, no, our grapes aren't genetically modified. So let's do a show of hands. Forget the technology. Okay, who thinks that these grapes have been genetically modified? Raise your hand. So this would be presumably people that have definitions that traditional breeding is also a form of genetic modification. Okay, what about, so those of you that don't think these are genetically modified? Okay, so everybody else. What's the answer to the third question? Do you sell plants or cuttings? No, they're patented. Are these genetically modified or not? By certain definitions, not necessarily by your definition, and your definition is fine.
Isn't that always been like kind of an issue with trying to patent something?
Right, so we could get into, that's a whole nother class.
Yeah.
We could get into all the issues of what does it take to be able to patent a biological organism.
Well, once it becomes its own cultivar, it's actually very simple.
Right, so these are genetically distinct grapes. They've been produced by artificial selection, not by genetic modification, but by selecting certain alleles of certain genes. So they're genetically distinct. So they can apply for a patent and patent their genetically distinct. You decide whether that means genetically modified or not for you. So I love the way they answer this. Oh, it's so flattering that you ask, but no. We've put a ton of work into this. You know how long grapes take to reproduce, right? So why are you even asking us? If there was ever a stupid question, that was probably it. Can I just have a plant and plant it in my yard and grow my own cotton candy grapes? No, this is America, pal. Capitalism. It turns out that grapes, if anything, are actually probably one of the closest plants, although this happens to a lot of plants, to a real frankenfood. So what's this picture next to Frankenstein's monster depicting? I know nobody here, I think, is a plant science major, but...
Yeah, they're just grafting, but generally you do that with all grapes. You have a rootstock that's resistant to a lot of diseases. You have a plant that's going to be producing the higher volume.
Right. So a lot of crops that we produce, including humans, are really noisy. No. Let's just shut this door. They've got paper airplanes out there. Don't you want to be out there with them? So, yeah, citrus, apples, grapes. The citrus plant in my backyard is grafted. There's a rootstock that's resistant to certain diseases, pathogens. So you take the trunk, essentially, and roots of a tree that's resistant to pathogens so it won't get diseased. But it turns out that those more wild citruses really taste like crap. So you graft on good-tasting citrus shoots onto the disease-resistant trunk. And that's what's happening here as well, as was described. So you take a hardy or disease-resistant rootstock, and then you graft on the scion, or the type of cultivar that actually produces the good-tasting or high-bearing fruit that you want. When I grew up, we had 5 apple trees in my backyard, and it had 30 different varieties of apples. So we had to eat different types of apples all year round. So this is a real frankenfood. This is actually taking pieces of different organisms and sticking them together, same species, but different varieties, into a single organism, like Frankenstein's monster. Does this count as genetic modification? Would you consider this a genetically modified food? Something worth thinking about. But it's a frankenfood. Okay, so when we ask all these sorts of questions, it's useful to know something about the legal environment. We started with the Socrative poll, which was, do you think these foods should be labeled? And of course, then the next question is, how do we define it? Do frankenfoods count? Do grafts count as genetic modification? That's up to you, or it's up to Congress. The most recent, or one of the most recent acts of Congress, this is not a law yet. It's halfway to being a law. The House of Representatives passed earlier this year a law that would forbid states from coming up with their own laws regarding whether or not foods could be genetically labeled as genetically modified. So it would be a federal law. It would be. The Senate is currently, right, so the House passed it. The Senate still needs to talk about it and vote as well. And then it would have to be signed into law. So, but the proposal is not to let states make that decision, that there would be federal jurisdiction over whether or not foods that are genetically modified be labeled or not. So important to keep paying attention to the news about this topic if you feel very strongly about this topic. So
Federal government stance.
they don't have a stance. As far as I know, there is no official stance yet.
So then why say that states can't do it if they don't have a stance?
Good question. Ask your representative. And of course, there are lobbyists on both sides when these bills go onto the floor for a vote, trying to make two sides of the argument. So what's the side of the argument for genetically modified organisms?
It's cheaper.
So money. Okay, so it's so related to that, you can produce more food to feed more people, presumably. That's the argument. Anybody from the other side of the conversation? What are your personal opinions on pros or cons of genetically modified food? If you said they need to be labeled, why do you want to know whether they need to be labeled? Or why do you want to know that you're eating a genetically modified food?
In case they're potentially dangerous.
Absolutely. Right, number one concern. My right to know what I eat. What if genetically modified foods are bad for us, or they do something bad, and so forth? Clearly, yeah, that's the main concern. So on one hand, there's some benefits, on the other hand, there's some costs, so we need some time, maybe cost-benefit analysis. So I wanted to show you a few examples of genetically modified foods. Again, you got a definition, your own personal definition. You decide whether or not you think these are okay to eat or not, and whether or not you'd want them to be labeled. We've already talked about Teosinte and maize. There's a picture I showed a few weeks ago. To me, yeah, that's genetic modification through artificial selection. Not people in a lab, but there's a continuum here. This is humans taking mutations that nature provided us and making what we can use as food. Okay. We started with tomatoes. We've got the small tomato, we've got the ginormous tomato. I said those were different varieties. They're different species. And you can make a transgenic tomato, as they did in this paper. The plus sign indicates plus contains a transgene, a gene that was moved from the small tomato. And what was the effect? So minus is no transgene. So these scientists were looking for parts of chromosomes that control how big a fruit gets. So what's the difference between no transgene and transgene? When you look at that, it's It's a little bit smaller. So that just proved that they found one part of one chromosome they took out of a small tomato, put it in a big tomato. It made that big tomato a little bit smaller. Is that a transgenic tomato? They took one gene out of the same species, just a small variety. They artificially put it into a big tomato that made the big tomato a little bit smaller.
Well, isn't a big part of this debate like the quality of the food after it's been modified? So we can't really answer these questions unless we know how it changes the
Or if it's safe.
nutritional value.
Yeah, yeah. So are these tomatoes any different, really? They've got a different sequence of DNA, slightly, because we've stuck an additional gene in there. But yeah, it's a fabulous point. So it would be good to have more research on nutritional quality of the foods, and then, of course, the safety. Okay, here's the most recent one. AquAdvantage Salmon. It sounds genetically modified, doesn't it? They've got a snazzy name. There's probably it's probably trademarked. Copyright, registered trademark, I don't know, something like that. So last month, within the last month, the USDA approved this genetically modified fish to be sold for consumption. I don't know if it's on the market yet, but they approved this salmon to be put on the market eventually. All this company did was they made the salmon produce growth hormones, their own growth hormones, just more of them. So genetic tinkering, genetic engineering, but no genes from other species, just modifying artificially how much of their own endogenous growth hormones these salmon produce so they grow faster. What's the problem with that?
Were there already existing salmon that had, like, say, a recessive genotype before they did this?
So essentially is the question, was this a
Was it
pre-existing?
random mutation?
No, so that's where the genetic engineering came in.
Could it have been a random mutation, though?
What do you think? We don't know the details, of course, because this is probably patented and proprietary material. They haven't told us, as far as I know, how they achieved this goal. But is it possible that some salmon in nature has the genotype that this company produced? Or ever did exist, or will in the future exist? We want to get filters. Yes. Maybe low chance, maybe really tiny chance. So what's better? And again, I'm trying not to take a stance. I'm just trying to offer opportunities for thought. What's better? Waiting until that random, really rare mutant that grows really fast appears by chance, and then hoping that you can raise and rear that fish and keep that trait around. It doesn't just randomly die or get eaten or die in the fish tank you're holding it in. Or is it better to just do that by in vitro, in glass, in the laboratory, genetic engineering?
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Other than, like, effects of GMOs on ourselves, like, in terms of us eating it, a lot of what tends to happen with GMOs is that they either outcompete, the natural variation, but also something that's not really, or I feel like isn't looked at as much, is the effect of the non-natural on, like, pests or other, organisms in
Yes.
the food web.
Absolutely.
So, and that's why I think it should be labeled,
Mhm.
because I think that sometimes we don't know a lot of what we need to in terms of like how that's gonna impact stuff.
Absolutely. So the main point here, in case you didn't hear, was we've already talked about what are the cons of eating transgenic foods, one of which might be our health. The other is how do the transgenic organisms impact ecology or the environment? So one of the main concerns about the AquAdvantage salmon is what if it escapes? They keep these in big floating pens out in the water, sometimes in the ocean. What happens if the net rips and one of these genetically modified salmon gets out and starts reproducing with natural salmon? Is there any problem with that? If they grow faster, if they reach adulthood faster, they outcompete natural salmon because they spawn earlier in life than the natural salmon do, and so forth. So it's not only what are the effects on us, it's what are the effects on every other species on the planet that we might be concerned with. Other questions or concerns, points, comments? I hope I don't sound like I'm so, I kind of am, but I'm trying to be neutral. And thank you very much for those of you that have commented. Here's a very closely related story, different organism, apple, the Arctic apple. Right? Apples brown when you cut them because the cells release this enzyme polyphenol oxidase, and it reacts with oxygen and turns the flesh brown. So what did this clever company from Washington State do, which is where a lot of our apples come from? They either engineered or found, you decide which, I don't know because it's proprietary information. They turned down the amount of transcription, as we've looked at in the last couple of weeks, maybe some mutations in promoters or enhancers, turned down the expression of the gene that encodes that enzyme that causes the browning. So all they've done is taken the gene that's normally transcribed in the apple and just dialed down the amount of that enzyme that the apple produces. Stops it from browning when you cut it. So you've got regular, non-GMO, and you've got the Arctic apple. Cut at the same time, you can see the difference for yourself, right? Is it worth all that work? Produce the Arctic apple? What do you think? If you were an investor, if you had $100,000 to be investing in a company that's going to make apples that don't brown as quickly, why not? I see you vigorously shaking your head, so I'm hoping you've got a good explanation.
I don't know, it just seems like, I'm not going to say a waste of time, but it kind of is. I mean, there's every industry person that really hates browning apples.
There you go. It's almost the who cares.
Yes.
Like, oh, so my apple's a little bit brown.
It's almost like a just because we can thing.
So yes, just because we can. Well, it turns out, for example, that McDonald's, if you eat at McDonald's, I'm being neutral. When you get when your kids or you get those baggies of sliced apples that they put in the Happy Meals or whatever, or on the salads, for those of you that are eating salads as adults, right? They treat those with chemicals to keep them from browning in the bags so they can have them for I don't know how long. I don't want to say because this is being recorded and I don't want to get sued by McDonald's. Who knows, weeks maybe. They don't brown. So maybe there's a benefit to McDonald's, or maybe there's a benefit to us to eating apples that are transgenic so they don't brown, as opposed to eating apples that have been chemically treated so they don't brown. So then we get back to safety. Is it better for us to be ingesting a transgenic organism or a chemically treated organism? Right? You choose. Okay, this is where I really try to represent the other side of the story, the let's not do GMOs. There's a situation with rice where you've got rice that you breed because it makes really big kernels and they're tasty and we can cook them. That's illustrated here on the left. Rice, not necessarily the glyphosate-resistant rice. And then you've got rice's weedy relative, these big, giant, hairy suckers in this picture that are in the foreground. Right? They're rice. They're just not the ones that have been artificially or naturally selected to be useful as food. They're the wild relatives of rice. So this is an issue for people that operate rice paddies because the natural rice will come live side by side with the rice that they actually try to harvest. They don't want the wild rice in there. It screws up the harvest. They have to figure out how to get it out of the rice they harvest and so forth. So what do the farmers do? And this is in current practice. This is not hypothetical. You buy transgenic rice that is resistant to this herbicide, glyphosate, which is also known as Roundup. So these are sometimes called Roundup-ready plants. The idea is that you take your glyphosate-resistant Roundup-ready rice, you plant it, and then you spray the field every so often with glyphosate, a common herbicide. And it kills the weedy relatives, so they're not taking up space, they're not adding bad, unsavory rice to the rice you're harvesting, and everybody's happy. That's the story anyway. That's one story. So why could this be bad? Rice plants that we're going to harvest that are made resistant to an herbicide.
Is the wild specimen live anywhere else besides the
Right, so the wild species grows all over the place, and one of the concerns was, well, what if the wild rice and the farmed rice hybridize and the Roundup resistance, the herbicide resistance gene gets passed from the cultivated rice into natural populations. And then all of a sudden, so through hybridization, because these are the same species, just different cultivars, strains, what happens if the genetically modified, the transgene, the gene that was inserted to make the rice resist glyphosate, what if it escapes into the wild populations through plants naturally breeding with each other in the wild? So then you make all the weedy rice eventually resistant to the herbicide. Then maybe we're back to the, well, what's the point? Was it a waste of money? Well, maybe for 25 or 30 years we got Roundup resistant plants, but then once everybody's resistant to Roundup, then you've got to get another herbicide to use and start the whole process over again. What everybody assumed about transgenic plants is written, I'm sorry for all the text, but is written up here. Two assumptions. That if you made a transgene, this is in the absence of treatment with herbicide. So imagine you've planted a rice paddy, you've got herbicide-resistant rice, you've got wild rice, and you're not treating them with herbicide. Everybody assumes that the transgenic organism won't do any better than its wild relative in the absence of herbicide. Because otherwise, other than that one difference, one's herbicide resistant, one's not, they're the same species. So one won't outcompete the other. The transgenic organism isn't better off just by having a herbicide resistance gene when you're not applying herbicide. We even go so far as to assume that there might actually even be a cost to those plants to having that transgene, because now they're producing extra proteins that their wild relative doesn't normally, the proteins that allow these rice to resist the herbicide. So it might actually be detrimental. Proponents claim, that is, proponents of GMOs, might actually be detrimental to the genetically modified plants to be transgenic. It's an extra cost to those plants. So this is the way things sat for years until this paper came out in 2013. They looked at the fitness, or how healthy the herbicide-resistant rice was compared to wild, not genetically modified. And they found something really scaringly surprising. So here's one piece of evidence for the let's not do GMOs. So the filled-in columns are the genetically modified, and the open columns are wild or non-genetically modified, essentially. So these columns, we're looking at 4 different strains, 4 different comparisons. It's all the same, all left side, dark column GMO versus a wild pear. Okay, what are the phenotypes we're looking at on the y-axis? Tryptophan concentration, let's skip that one. What's panel B? Rate of photosynthesis. Which plant is growing faster or metabolizing faster? Genetically modified or wild? Genetically modified. In the absence of herbicide. So you just plant the wild plants, the genetically modified plants in a field, let them grow. For some reason, the genetically modified plant that's supposed to only be resistant to herbicide grows faster. It metabolizes faster. What else they found? What are we looking at now? Seed germination rate, how fast the seeds grow. Who wins? The GMO. In the absence of the herbicide, right? Of course, if this was in the presence of the herbicide, you might expect this because it's killing the plants that don't have the Roundup Ready gene. In the absence of herbicide, the transgenic plant still does better. And we've got panel C down here. Number of seeds. Who's fitter? Who's making more kids? The GMO. in the absence of Roundup, glyphosate. Holy crap. So then people went wild and said, wait a second, this is not supposed to happen. Genetically modified organisms are not supposed to be fitter than their wild relatives just because they're transgenic. So maybe we do need to spend a lot more time thinking about how genetically modified organisms might impact their ecology and the interactions with other species. So we've talked a little bit about risk to other species. So what happens if one of these transgenes escapes into wild populations? We can never go back and undo that process. So that's one risk. What about the risks to you of eating truly genetically engineered in the laboratory organisms? Do you have any particular fears or concerns about? We've talked briefly about nutritional content. Other than that,
Okay, so this isn't like about the GMO itself.
Yeah.
Like we just talked about Roundup, and so glyphosate, it's different groups argue over this, but some say that it's a carcinogen and it binds pretty tightly to different things, and so it's found in like a crazy amount of like the rain, it's found in our waterways, etc.
Yep.
And so if it is a carcinogen, are there steps that the agriculture industry takes to prevent that from getting into areas it should, or like at least making it to my plate?
so here's another related question. If we're going to use these transgenic organisms, that means we're going to continue to use herbicides to kill the relatives of these plants that we don't want. And is that a good thing? Or should we be trying to explore different avenues of preventing the weedy rice from growing in the paddies? How do we keep glyphosate out of our food? And I was shocked to learn, I think it was a seminar last year, maybe, somebody came and talked, and it turns out that the local water districts, I think, if I remember correctly, don't actually test water. They test it for a lot of things, lead, fluoride, etc. Don't test for herbicides in our water. So who knows? So those are not controlled regionally, at least. The local water production districts don't tell us how much herbicide is in our water.
It takes you longer to drown from an herbicide than it does water though.
Is that true? And water has its own material safety data sheet too, so don't even think, water is dangerous. Yep. Okay, so there is an exit activity, another brief one, please. I just want to see if anything changed your mind about genetically modified organisms. So let me start the next Socrative activity, and then I'll talk over you while I'm going to tell you about what we're doing for the last 3 classes of the term. Okay, so go ahead with that Socrative activity, and we'll talk about sex, genetics of sex, sex determination, sexual disorders, Friday and Monday. Monday, the exam review questions. If you're going to write any and send them to me, would be due on Monday. If you don't send me some, then there won't be a review guide for the final, because it will be a cumulative final. It will be weighted towards the material we've covered since the last test. So maybe 40% or 50% of the material will be on what we've covered since the 4th test. It will be cumulative, start of the class through next Wednesday, when we talk about genetics and forensics.